Hi everyone, welcome to the Painters Podcast. I'm here today with Jack from Real World Epoxies, but also known as Resin Jack. So can you tell us a bit about yourself? You know, obviously you're working in that epoxy space. A lot of painters are moving into those areas and working in those areas. So can you give us a bit of a history on yourself and what you do?
Sure.
Yep.
So firstly, thank you for the invite.
Yep.
I appreciate this. I'm an electrical engineer by trade, if you like. I moved into this field, developed a passion for the chemistry side of things.
Yep.
There is a long story there. But really, and that was back in early 2000s. And I really started with regard to R&D on a couple of product lines. And one of the lines was epoxies, and particularly underwater capable epoxies.
I actually remember, I think we talked about that once.
We could have.
We did about you doing some ships.
Yeah. So that's
ship stuff.
Early on, it became about very niche type epoxies and more so resin flooring than protective coatings. We certainly did a lot of protective coatings, but so that started in the early 2000s, 2001.
Yep.
Formulating manufacturing was where it all started.
Yep.
I like problem solving. So naturally you can formulate products to overcome certain problems.
Yep.
And then you start to realise that there's a whole lot of other problems in our industry and with regard to the installation and specification and education, training and so forth. So that's where everything keeps branching further and further out. What else can we develop? What else can we solve to help people improve overall in the industry sector? And that's led me on to the qualification for our industry.
Yep.
A resin flooring qualification, and happy to talk about that and how
more
that can
than
apply
happy
to the painters. And,
Yeah.
Both nationally and internationally we're having those discussions. It's not just a problem of Australia, it's an international problem.
It's exactly the same with painting. It's an international problem, you know. I mean, there's not enough training, you know. And we've had a chat earlier on today, before now, and had a few discussions about the what we see as deficiencies within the training sector per se. That the people today aren't necessarily trained in the newest products and what's available out there, and you know, like you said, you know, your sector is fairly new in that training area.
Yes. Sadly but true.
Yes.
And I think that when it sort of first became obvious that we really needed to step up and become a professional trade, the first step was a qualification. And I did do a lot of international inquiries as to what other countries had, associations and training programs and so forth. And it was really only the UK that had a resin flooring training association and program.
Yeah, okay.
I did ask whether they were interested in setting up a chapter in Australia, but they were not willing to do so, not that interested. And that's kind of what forced, you know, us to get into it here.
Yep. No, fabulous. So, what do you find? You know, obviously you've been doing this now for what, 20 odd years? 23 or something years. Okay. So, what do you find? Because obviously there is a massive sector now that I'm aware of, and you'd be aware of, that painters are moving into your floor coatings and your those types of things, particularly your concrete coatings and your flake floors, and you know, there's certain, I know businesses out there that are just specialising in those sorts of things. So what are you finding and what are you hearing out there or seeing out there? Because I'm assuming that you go out and do inspections and things like that on those types of substrates.
Yeah.
What do you find that I guess could be done better, or what are the major problems that you're finding and things like that?
I think even though there are a lot of similarities between painting and resin flooring, there are some fundamental differences, and if you set that context right, everything flows from that. If you get the context right, the detail takes care of itself. So as an example, the way I try to explain the difference is painting a wall is very much about opacity.
Yep.
A consistent colour, no one's walking on the wall, so it's not so much about a trafficable surface that has to have longevity and is subject to impact the same way that a floor might be.
Yep.
When you're dealing with resin flooring, it changes to something that is now not just aesthetics, and I don't mean to say that there aren't wall coatings for other purposes, but
of course.
It's very much about a trafficable surface, and it has to withstand whatever takes place, whether it's spills and impact damage and all
different
sorts of
chemicals
other
and
things.
could be anything. Yeah.
And so that immediately you start to think differently as far as film thicknesses.
Yep.
When it's opacity, it's about, well, you can get away with thinner coats.
Yep.
Once it's trafficable, you start to have higher builds.
Yes.
And if you set that context, you understand now that your repair materials, your substrate preparation changes and so forth. You now need mechanical profile, you need better porosity and so forth when it comes to flooring. And perhaps I can best explain how that's changed in the so-called older days.
Yep.
Or when I first started, acid etching was still quite popular, and painters are very familiar with the acid etching.
Well, that's part of we actually teach that.
Yep.
That is actually still part of our trade, is acid etching.
Yeah, and I think it certainly serves a purpose for certain types of coatings, thin films.
Yep.
And if I was to put it in a category, I'd say less than 200 microns.
Okay.
0.2 of a millimetre.
Yep.
And the reason why I feel comfortable about that is because the coatings at that film thickness don't generally have the integral strength to pull away as easily.
Yep.
So it works better with thin films. When you start putting a thicker film onto an acid etch, you can leave yourself a bit vulnerable because those thicker films, when they start to build up in film thickness, have integral strength.
Yes.
That when put under stress can end up delaminating if you didn't get your prep spot on.
Right. Yep.
And acid etching, rightly or wrongly, can end up inconsistent if you're not thorough in how you do it.
Yep.
Some coatings are also susceptible to the pH levels.
Yes.
So they want soda
pH
washes
test.
and so forth before you coat, and that sort of practice isn't commonly done.
No.
So,
well, I'd be surprised. I mean, most of the painters out there that I know, they'd be still, I believe, acid etching. And particularly the ones that are doing the flake floors. So that's probably one of the areas that we do as painters would be that type of system where they're putting down, they're acid etching first and then coating over that. Half of them probably don't even check their moisture levels before they do things like that because that's another problem. That and that's one thing that I've found that I cheat a bit when we're training. We've got obviously concrete driveways outside. In the morning, if I know that we're doing surface preparation or we're doing, protective coatings and those sorts of things, I'll go and throw a bucket of water out there.
Good.
And so that way everything looks dry.
Yeah.
But then when we get out the moisture meter, so I'll ask the question because the students have done the theory component, and I'll ask the questions. Okay, guys, does this look good? If you just give it a bit of a sweep off and away you go. And half of them say, yeah, that looks fine, we'd paint on that. And then so we get out the moisture meter, and of course it could be sitting at 20, 23% in that range. And they're saying, but it looks dry, why is that? But it might have been a shower of rain, or it could have been anything like that. So we find that in the training, showing them those sorts of things can make a big difference.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
You touched on a number of points there.
Yeah.
So if I was to talk to resin flooring people, they would generally not be acid etching.
Yep.
They're all investing in mechanical abrasive techniques. Grinder is the most popular, readily available. Shot blasting is a tremendous method of preparation for resin flooring, but not commonly adopted here.
Would it be because of the mess, or what's
It's expensive.
Okay.
The expensive, 25 grand setup. It's a lot of money,
Yeah,
and you can buy grinders for a lot less than that.
Yeah.
And I think part of the preference for not acid etching is that there's a more consistent finish.
Yep.
More consistent adhesion.
Okay.
Less chance of a callback.
Yep.
And so where I have seen painters get into trouble in our area is to do with early delamination, early failures.
Of course.
And it is generally a prep issue. It's not that they didn't do it applied it properly. It was more that they perhaps didn't understand some of the things that could catch them out when it came to change from a thin film to something that has a higher build, like a flake floor, as an example.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So what other sort of problems, I mean, obviously delamination's one of the big ones. What other sort of things could the guys be made aware of that they're looking for the potential hazards or potential problems that they might come across? Because, you know, from our earlier discussions, and I'll just go back to that, was where we were talking about the education and the training of these guys. You know, obviously you've got a school and you do educate your applicators and things like that on the use of your products. You know, but it's not necessarily on a large volume scale. You know, and this is where I think a lot of guys and particularly painters, because on that larger volume scale, if you're going and doing 1,000 square metres of a warehouse, you're not going to be, or very few people are going to get that 100% correct.
Yeah. Also, the education side, I wanted to just raise one quick point, because you said the larger scale.
Yep.
My field is generally, or my field of expertise is generally to do with solventless epoxies.
Yep.
So fundamentally, where people get caught with a solventless epoxy versus something that's waterborne or solvent-borne, meaning it has an evaporative component to it, is pot life and working time.
Yep.
So painters will often be used to having time to get it out, long pot life, and they can sit in roller trays and they can roll and so forth. With a solventless product, if you leave it in a bucket or in a tray, it goes off very quickly.
Okay.
If you get it out on the floor and spread it out, you've got a massive heat sink that can take the heat away from it.
Yep.
And then you've got more working time.
Okay.
So painters will get caught on large scale with the solventless because they're thinking it behaves much like it does the product that they're used to, and they don't work on spikes, they don't use squeegees and so forth. So there's lots of, this comes onto the education side now, where there's techniques, there's ways of getting resin flooring out that doesn't cross over, you're not used to it.
Yep.
And that's where the education has to come into play. Yes, you can do it with a roller, but you can also end up in trouble.
Yep. Okay. So, I've learned something there.
There you go.
Something different.
I have to get you skating around on spikes.
Exactly. So you're saying that the resins, they don't use spikes, did you mean? Or they do use the spikes?
No, they do use spikes.
They do use the spikes.
So that you can walk back.
And it'll just it puts itself back.
Well, and you're working backwards.
Yep.
So even though the resins, if they have a high film build, can repair themselves, you are working your way backwards the whole time on spikes.
Yep.
So you're correcting anything that's happening as you're
going.
working.
Yep. No, okay. So, well, hopefully someone learnt something else out of that too.
So if you're doing 1,000 square metre place, you want to be thinking about how do I squeegee and spikes.
Yeah.
And so forth.
And do all of, Oh, look, I've seen some of the videos that you've shared and things like that, and the finishes you can get are just incredible that you can't get with anything else. You know, is there any, I guess, special techniques for our listeners, our watchers, any special techniques that you would recommend, to trial products, do testing before you do something? You know, because I mean, I imagine you stuff up something, the product costs are going to be astronomical, and you stuff it up, it's going to cost you 2-3 times as much to rectify those sorts of things. So what's where would you go with that?
Well, we talked about earlier what type of person is it that wants to learn, and the line I use all the time is you pay for your education one way or another.
Yep.
And either you're going to pay for it up front, you're going to go and invest in courses and get trained and so forth up front before you start playing on the floor.
Yep.
Or you're going to start playing on the floor and have to redo and pay for your education in product and
grinding back.
And if you have a client, it becomes, now there's an element of professionalism that comes into question and all sorts of other things. So me personally, I like to invest in my education. I want to be upfront about it. I want to understand why I want to do something a certain way. And that's how I encourage most people. I find that is less embarrassing.
Yep.
Like as far as failures on the job.
Yep.
It is always easier doing it properly the first time, if you know how to do it the first time, than trying to rectify something afterwards.
Yeah.
And even though there are now a number of manufacturers that'll offer 2 or 3 day courses,
Yep.
which I think is beneficial to understand how their products behave.
Yep.
I would never think that that's adequate to then go out and start doing work for yourself.
Yes.
You're gonna pay.
You're going to get. I 100%
You're gonna
agree.
pay for it.
100% agree.
So there is now a formal way to get educated,
Yep.
as in through the TAFEs. There is a resin flooring stream in the hard flooring sector.
Yep.
It's also been broken down now to a skill set. So in theory, other qualified painters or waterproofers or whatever it may be can pick up that skill set and
Yep.
then go and do resin flooring. Then you've got confidence and knowledge about what to do rather than getting caught out.
Yeah, okay. So, because I know guys that are out there, painters, that are moving into that flooring sector, because that's, it's a niche market at the moment. And once again, I'll fall back onto those flake floors, because that seems to be the areas that the builders are looking at for a point of difference when they're selling in houses and things like that. So those flake floors in garages and those sorts of things. So would you recommend that there's specific units that they should learn for doing those sorts of things? Because, obviously your application methods are slightly different. You've got different, yes, you are using brushes, rollers and those types of things, but there are still variances in your products and your, like we said before, your wet film thicknesses and those types of things.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of painters wouldn't even know what a wet film thickness gauge looked like, unless they did it at college. It's one of those that a lot of people don't understand what they're looking for with looking at material safety data sheets and understanding just with the data sheets of how wet film thickness works. So I guess, could you explain probably how and the importance behind understanding why you need to have those thickness built?
Okay, so again, you touched on a couple of
points.
If
Yep.
I
I do.
if I can just grab it individually.
Yep.
So the first one is a lot of builders put out a package that they call painting, but it is often painting and resin flooring.
Yes.
So that's how painters end up doing it. They understand and know how to quote for painting, perhaps not quite sure about how to do the resin floors, but before you know it, they're doing it and so forth.
Hopefully well.
Hopefully, but not always the case.
Not always the case,
and that's
no.
an expensive lesson. And
That's right.
And I do know a number of painters that just hand over the resin flooring because they know it's not their
It's outside
field,
their scope. Yep.
and it's too easy to get bitten on them.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the first point there. The next point you started to talk about was to do with film thicknesses.
Yes.
And in the solventless epoxy world, film thicknesses is actually quite easy because the coverage is all centered around, there's no evaporative component.
Okay.
So laws of physics comes into play. 1 litre covers 1 square metre at 1 millimetre thick.
Yep.
If
Yep.
you're required to put it down at 500 microns or half a millimetre thick,
Yep.
well then 1 litre covers 2
square metres. Yep.
So it actually, a lot of resin flooring guys are just working from coverages because they understand as long as they're putting down the right literage, then they end up
With the correct
correct
film.
film build.
Yeah, the dry film at the end of the day. Yep.
There are specifications can look at film builds. Generally, they're specified as systems though.
Yep.
So that's your method of prep, your primers and so forth, right through to final handover.
Yep.
There will be some that will check dry film thicknesses on concrete
Yep.
as an
If you've
overall
got-
check.
If you've got the extra money to go and buy the dry
It
film
is an
thickness
expensive device, and that's why wet film gauges and taking photos of your wet film gauges as you
Yes,
do each
is
coat
important.
makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
It's cheap insurance.
Yep.
In the event that there is a problem or someone questions you.
And yeah,
And,
that one's not just for people too, for the painters out there. That's not just something for epoxies. That's actually something for that I know certainly on the large commercial jobs and those sorts of things. There's a lot of testing that goes on the dry film and the wet film thicknesses, and even in the residential market, doing that as a protection for yourself when you're applying the coatings can make a big saving at the end of the day if there's a paint fault.
Yeah.
You know, because if you're doing and checking and making sure that you're applying the coatings at the correct thickness and the product fails, and you can show that you've followed all the specifications, you've followed everything, it's going to give you a better chance for your warranty purposes and things like that, that you're not necessarily at fault. You know, I imagine that'd be the same.
Yeah, very much so. And I emphasise a lot about record keeping
Yep.
when it comes to project management.
Yep.
It's not an area that's done well.
No.
I was fortunate in the sense that many of the projects I was involved with, I'd be hands-on, on-site as a supervisor, and this is often defence projects, so Navy projects.
Navy projects, yep.
They're very anal about record keeping, and it just taught me, once it became a habit, it actually works for you.
Yeah.
It's not a burden anymore. And the example I use is part of record keeping is taking measurements of climatic conditions before you start.
Yep.
Everyone's out of the space. You're now there and you've got your instruments. And it's a moment to take the records and just finally check things.
Yep.
And that, you know, rather than these projects, you're so often about your prep and you get it cleaned up and start. You can't start quickly enough.
Yep.
But that's when you get caught on something. So that little habit of just that pause, the guys end up tidying up things, sorting things out, going and checking because they realise they forgot such and such and whatever else. So I encourage that process because it actually ends up helping you. It's not just a
giving you
pain in the
space.
butt to record things and take photos. And
Yep.
I don't know how many projects now that I've been asked questions about many years later, and I can show them a photo of what was done on what day and what we were doing and why and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think that adds a lot to your credibility and
your professionalism at the end.
And at the end of the day, that's what you should be able to charge for.
That's
your business.
100%. 100%. So, you know, I mean, are there any other things that you think that, you know, I guess the painters may consider, you know, if they're looking at going down the line of going and specialising into, you know, your resins and epoxies and those sorts of things, what would you recommend that they do? You know, I mean, obviously, I guess you're going to say go and get the training. That would be number one.
I am. And the similarities are there, but they're also quite different.
Yep.
And so any conversation I have with anyone that's starting in our industry, it's about trying to understand them and their values and where they're going to be best suited. So as an example, there are some people that are attention to detail.
Yep.
They'll be very good at certain types of finishes, but not very effective at others. So as an example, if you're going to be doing residential or decorative finishes, residential or retail and commercial, you want to have attention to detail. It is not about speed.
No.
So when people say they want to get into the resin flooring sector, I try to extract out of them, are you well suited to this or not?
Yep.
Yes, you have a capital outlay on equipment. This
isn't
isn't brushes and rollers.
Yep.
And every consumable is disposable. Like you can use a lot of solvents to try to clean out brushes.
But it's not, at the end of the day,
it doesn't tend to work that well.
No.
So you tend to learn how to use disposables and so forth. So they're all the conversations that are, I think, very productive at the front end. You go in understanding what questions to ask when you're next standing in front of a manufacturer or someone that's selling you grinding equipment or whatever. So you end up with what suits where you're trying to go.
It's more knowledge. It's education and knowledge. You know, I guess that's where you're
headed. And I don't know how many times I get inquiries about people wanting to do metallics.
Okay.
Learn how to do metallics. Metallic floors, they look fantastic, or 3D flooring. You know,
3D. I've seen the 3D. Yeah, they look unbelievable.
Phenomenal. And I say to people that it's like you asking, I want to run in the 100 metres in the Olympics.
Yep. It's so limited, the number of people, the training behind it.
Well,
and
there's so much work to get to that point.
Yeah.
So, if you want to learn how to do that, which is in the upper echelon of capability and skills, by all means, but you're going to start at prep and assessing floors. Like even just being able to assess a floor before you start doing anything for quotation to understand what's going on. And you talk about moisture. Yeah. But flatness of floors and weakness of the floor. And so all of these things, if you don't get that grounding, you're going to be in trouble trying to do a metallic.
Well, okay. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, well, it's like a decorative finish for a painter. You know, for a painter to walk in and suddenly create an imitation marble or a wood grain or something like that. That it's if you don't, and particularly if you're going to do it and then have to have the longevity of it. Yeah. You know, and the lifespan of whatever it is that the coating's going on to that you're doing, it doesn't happen overnight. It's the same. You have to understand. We're just talking different surfaces. The preparation, the preparation for a gyprock wall is going to be different to the preparation for a concrete
block or whatever. Yeah.
Or whatever, and that's the same right across the board.
Yeah.
So, it's and look, part of the painting trade, we touch on sections of it, but we don't go anywhere near the depth that needs to be done, or that understanding, like you said, some of the manufacturers and there's organisations out there that might run 2, 3, 4 day courses, but in 2, 3, 4 days, you're not going to necessarily get that expertise to actually take on a $50,000 job with confidence.
Exactly.
And this is, that's why we have apprenticeships.
Yep.
We do 4-year apprenticeship. You were saying earlier that, the flooring's 3-year. That's, so it's not something that painters would necessarily be able to just pick up at the click of a finger. They might have some basic understandings, but not an overall and overarching, and that's why there's an apprenticeship for it. So I think that's really important, that particularly painters understand that. They've got to understand that, yes, the builder might want you to go and do a flake floor, but it doesn't mean that you've necessarily got that underpinning knowledge and understand everything behind it. Because, I've heard plenty of faults and people that it's actually cost them a lot of money to go and rectify. Because they just don't have all of that underpinning stuff that's needed.
Yeah, and I don't know about the cost of painting materials, but resin floorings, because of the high build, they're expensive materials.
Well, like you just said to me, you're looking at 1 square metre a litre. In some cases, you're probably looking at 2 or 3 square metres a litre. And that stuff isn't cheap. No. It's not like your basic ceiling flat.
No.
Or your low shade acrylics. It's a completely different beast.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different... Like, I can remember when we went, and I found it personally very challenging, because I went from old school using full gloss enamel. Okay, so everything... When I did my trade, and I painted, everything we finished in full gloss enamel. When they went to the water-based enamels...
Okay.
I struggled to try and get... I still have full gloss enamel in my house. I just can't get a finish that I'm happy with the water-based enamels. Yet, the world is moving water-based enameled.
Yes.
And it was a completely different beast to actually apply when I started. Gloss enamel, you had time to work it, you had time to get your film right, and then you move to the water-based, and it's a completely different feel.
Yep.
And then you end up, obviously you don't get the high gloss like you would with an enamel, because it hasn't got the resins and whatnot in it that actually hold it together and to get that reflective properties. But when you get the water-based enamels, it's a nightmare. Well, it was back to start with.
Yeah.
So I actually had to go and re-educate myself on the use of those products, and particularly now training apprentices in the use of those products.
Yep.
Most of them are using them at work now anyway, so they're actually, they know what they're doing. But they've never used gloss enamel, so then I'm training them in the use of gloss enamel, because they don't use them on job sites. So it's the way that everything's sort of evolved and changed within our painting industry over the last 10 years. I imagine the changes for you guys over the last 10 years would have been similar, or would it have been, that if you've done something, if you were doing something 10 years ago, would you be following the same thing today?
It's a good point, good question. The way, so when it, I'll use it with regard to the qualification. When it came time to look at the qualification, the idea was we can see that there are different resins that will be used. So epoxies is well known, but urethanes, PU cements and polyaspartics and polyureas and so forth. There's a number of different resin types.
Yep.
But if you can learn the fundamentals, as in minimum competency, in the solventless resin, then you're understanding can adapt to those other units, other types of resins.
Yep.
So that was our approach to how do we deal with an industry that is constantly trying to introduce new types of resins and so forth.
Yep.
Is get the fundamental understanding, and then that way you've been trained in that, and then yes, you're going to do those training days with the manufacturers. Now talking about those specific products. Okay, so this is now how you're going to do a polyaspartic for a flake floor.
Yep.
And here's the differences between how the qualification and so forth.
Yep.
So that's, I think, how we're dealing with that change. I think there's a bit of a problem, which you would probably also relate to, is that a lot of specifications that come through are copy and paste or used on previous jobs. It's not. I can understand how it happens because you might think that it's a similar thing. So anytime we get a specification that comes through, and this is particularly the people that don't necessarily know the catches, I always say, okay, I know that's been specified, or a product that's been specified. Let me just take a couple of steps back and ask some questions and see that it is the right thing and it's not going to give you grief later. Because even though you might be following the specification, if it turns into a disaster, your time is going to get tied up on that job. And you may or may not make an income from it. So I always look at specifications, and I'm very hesitant of equivalent type talk. In our trade in particular. And so, come back to ask the questions about, is this firstly the right sort of thing for what we're trying to do, and the traffic and how they're going to clean it and so forth. And then is that substrate even suitable for that type of finish? And so forth. And
well, I mean, I guess it's the same as the painting side as well, that, you know, you need to make sure that you're using the right products on the right substrates and so on and so forth in that regard. I mean, you're talking about half a dozen different names that I've vaguely heard throughout the years of the different resins and things like that. To us, it's probably more in the components of the products. Where we, as painters, yes, we do go through the makeup of paint and the components of paint and all of those sorts of things, and the use of what products on what substrates and those, you know, to give a rounded understanding. Certainly for painters, it's more of a rounded understanding, whereas you're talking about a very, very specific type of product for a substrate.
Or environment.
Environment even.
Whatever it's being used for.
So, whereas painters, you go in, you paint the external of the house with external acrylics. You know, whether it be the gutters, whether it be, so you're talking metal can be painted in your acrylics, you know, your external acrylics, you've got your walls, you've got your timber, you've got, you know, you might have fibro, we're all using the same product when it comes to a paint coating. You know, I mean, it's just a colour difference, you know, but we're still using the same product. Whereas when you're talking a concrete floor, you're going to use a completely different product to what you're going to use on a steel, on something else to use on. Whereas for us, it's a little bit more generic, I guess. Yours is a lot more specialised with the areas of what you're doing there.
Well, I think you just touched on, like, that in itself explains a lot why when I get inquiries from painters, they talk about epoxy flooring. And I talk about resin flooring for that reason, that generically speaking, yes, you could categorise a lot of things as epoxy flooring. But the minute that you think that that's going to apply to everything, you're going to get caught out. You're going to end up in trouble. And so, perhaps that's
probably helps to educate you a little bit there. There you go. Something's going the other way. You know, but look, that's, you know, I mean, I guess, is there anything else that you'd like to sort of add to what we've been talking about today? You know, I mean, we've touched on a few different points of the biggest one, probably education, and especially, you know, like we've just demonstrated there at the, you know, in that last little section, where painters generally, they can use the same product on multiples and multitudes, where they don't have that underpinning knowledge and that understanding when they're moving into a marketplace like resins or epoxies. There is a completely different skill set and a completely different understanding for the painters to learn. You can't just walk in there with a brush and roller and off you go. You know, is there anything I guess you'd like to add to that? That's
finding a place to practice, I think, is perhaps
the hardest.
The only thing I'd suggest at the end of that. Practicing on a client's floor is fraught with issues, and maybe that's stating something obvious, but far too often that's how things happen.
Yeah.
And then you're learning the lesson on the client's
on
floor.
the job. So how would you, I mean, obviously it's a difficult one because, you know, we go back to training and units of competency and how much you have to demonstrate. You know, I mean, I know in painting, for instance, you know, when it comes to spray painting, you've got to spray out X amount of metres, you know, in a competent manner to be deemed competent.
Yeah.
You know, you have to brush and roll X number of metres to become competent. But with the products that we're using and the if you muck it up, it's not you can repair it at a lower cost factor to what you potentially can with the resins. Your cost factor of a muck up could be astronomical. You know,
well,
if
not
you're
just
having
in
to strip
product,
it all
in
back.
labour to
in
remove
labour,
it.
yeah.
They're not necessarily easy things to remove.
No, that's right. So once again, with I can imagine for your units of competency, you'd have the same. They have to demonstrate X amount of metres that maybe aren't enough to warrant, you know, is there anything that you think that should be, you know, 5 metres, 10 metres, 20 metres? Is it, you know, where do you find, you know, in painting, it used to be you had to paint, so in marble, you used to have to do a marble board. Okay? Now, you have to do a minimum of 2 square metres or a door size.
Yeah.
So they've identified, you know, the same with wood graining, you have to do X amount, where that used to just be a little board.
Yeah.
You know, colour match, you have to do colour matching in different different products. You can't just do it in acrylics, you've got to do multiples in acrylics and multiples in enamel.
Yep.
So are there ways that you think that, you know, and I mean, obviously, I know from discussions with you that you were involved in that process, and I know it's a very lengthy and difficult process. I'm not trying to put you on the spot and say, no, there's not enough metres, because or no, there isn't. But
it's open for challenge.
To give them exactly. For, you know, you're talking. We're talking about industry. Industry isn't necessarily the right education. We educate.
Yeah.
But when you put it into what we educate in a controlled environment, and you're putting that out into an uncontrollable environment, potentially, you know, I mean, for yourselves, when a floor's been cleaned, ready to go, and someone walks through and you don't realise that they've got a bit of grease on their shoe, that's going to completely throw...
Going to cause you some grief.
The spanners in the works.
Yeah.
In a controlled training environment, that's not going to occur.
Okay, so right.
You know where I'm headed with this?
Oh, 100%.
You know, is there...
If I take a step back to before there was a resin flooring qualification, there was one unit on epoxy flooring.
Yep.
And there it was, I think it was really centred around a flake system.
Yep.
And it was a square metre.
Yep. Yep.
And that suits a training environment because the cost of materials isn't too high. So that, I mean, that's something else.
This is all the other things you've got to take into. Yep.
A real issue is there's a certain amount of material cost required to do decent training. But 1 square metre, you get to understand a process, but you can't show whether you can do it.
Yep.
And so when it was time for us to look at the qualification in each one of these units of competency, depending on whether it was a thin film roll coat or broadcast or a trowel down or whatever the actual unit was, we had to look at what point can you demonstrate that you can marry up things or you understand how to get a consistent finish. And so example, for a roll coat system, you had to demonstrate in front of an instructor 10 square metres.
Okay.
And the reason why 10 square metres is even if you still had one kit to put across the 10 square metres, I'd ideally like it so that you've got multiple kits, but let's say it's 10 square metres, you had to show that you can marry up one rolled section with the next rolled section and show that you understand the timing of it. So epoxies, again, because of the speed of the cure, or even worse, polyaspartics are super fast. You get into this rhythm of what's the speed that you have to work at to make it work and to get it to film, like the film to flatten out and so forth. So 10 square metres was chosen as the target size for a lot of those units.
Yep.
Then in addition to that, in the field, they had to provide evidence of them having done larger areas.
Yep.
Because that's now multiple kits.
Yes.
And so forth. So that's how we catered for that in each of the units. There's a smaller thing that demonstrates your ability, and then how does that translate into a larger scale to show that you're actually competent?
Yeah, but 10 metres is still a fairly large area if you're running a class of 10 students.
It is.
Yeah, and then of course you're not just doing that. Obviously, then it goes to your next group. It would be a lot of coordination, I imagine, on trying to do something like that, because you might have 100 square metres that have to be done. The next group coming through, you want to make sure that they understand the preparation side, because they've got to get rid of it.
Yep.
And
that is the coordination you talk about. And the way that I figured out that I would run it is a 2 slab setup. And then it's a matter of over how many days, like a block of training, how many days can I get them to complete on 2 slabs?
2 slabs. Yep.
And that was, showed that that's very doable.
Yep.
But it does come down to your training setup and how many students and so forth.
Yeah.
But what I keep coming back to is that's the industry telling you that that's what's going to be showing your ability.
Yeah.
If you reduce the size, are you showing your ability? And so you kind of had to get to a certain size to show it. And if you don't do that, well, then you're still leaving yourself open.
And then, of course, like you said before, the cost effectiveness of that.
Yeah.
Because I don't know exact figures, but I would imagine that the majority of your epoxies would be cost-wise. And I mean, I've bought, different 2-packs in the past and protective coatings and things like that we use in our training. And I know their costings are generally about 10 times or 8 to 10 times what you might pay for a stock standard paint. So you are talking, plus, your labour and different tools and things like that. So to put that into a training environment where you're literally multiplying everything by, just use 10 as an example, would make it a very expensive course to try and run. So I imagine TAFE would be looking at that from a profitability, or RTO's looking at it from a profitability side as well. That could be, because of the outlays.
That was certainly one of the factors that came into play when we are getting the package ready for federal government endorsement.
Yep.
So the thing to sort of keep in mind is this package is also it's under the flooring technology, which is vinyl, carpet, timber.
Yep.
Those materials aren't cheap either.
No, true.
Or
true.
if you look at the tiling sector,
yep,
they're not cheap
either.
either. So
yep.
Yes, it's going to be more
so
expensive
it's all
to train compared to paint, but is it in line with those other types of floor covering? It
probably is. It probably is. Carpet could be, but certainly your timber flooring and things like that, and particularly if you're going into parkentry and all of those other ones, then you're really starting to build up those dollar values.
Yeah, I don't know if they can recover those or whether they're removed.
Don't know. That's
destructive manner.
Yes, but you guys like destructive manner.
Well,
you don't have a choice but destructive manner.
Yes and no. So there's one of the things I talk about resin flooring, a benefit of resin flooring compared to some of those floor coverings, is at the end of life we can go back over the top as long as the process has been done well to start with.
Yep.
So you're not always having to grind back to concrete and start again.
Okay.
So it's not like in tiles, as an example.
Yep.
There are people that tile on top of tiles, but generally they're going to remove them, landfill, and then go again. With resin flooring, if it's intact, it's not flaking, meaning that it's delaminating.
Delaminating, yep.
You can look to prepare again and overcoat.
Okay.
So and then you're also only adding maybe 1 millimetre to your floor height, so you're not affecting door heights and
things
jams
like that.
and whatever else.
Okay.
So there are good and bad, and in training you can do a number of layers before you then have to remove as well.
Okay.
That's what I was sort of getting at.
Yeah, okay, no,
If you want to do it, you'll find ways of doing it.
You'll find ways of doing it, and you'll find the products. And that's where they reach out to you to find, hey, what I've got to do this. What do we, we do?
And I think training organisations will be supported by the manufacturers because, after all, it's in the manufacturer's interest to have qualified installers out there. And,
and their products in the hands. That's one thing that we've discovered.
Yep.
Yeah, if you get the products in the hands of the applicators, whether they're in training as an apprentice or whether they're upskilling themselves in some way.
Yep.
Once they get comfortable with a product, and tradies generally, if a painter finds a brush that he likes, he'll keep buying that brush.
Yeah.
He's just gonna go, a painter will just go, he'll see that brush, he'll see that roller, and he's gonna buy that same brand because he knows he's gonna get the same finish every time with it. You give him another brush to try, and he gets that same or finds something different, they will then look at changing that product, but they will never change from what they're comfortable with in their comfort zone, looking at even though it might be the latest, the newest, the greatest, the everything else, I know what I'm getting.
Yeah.
And
well, you touch on a sensitive topic there because the devil because rarely is anything perfect.
Yep.
So
exactly.
you're normally accepting something and becoming habitual because you've figured out how to make that work.
Yep.
And then you're reluctant to change because if I change something, now I'm going to have to figure it out again.
Yeah.
But, as an example, we've shown how to do a garage floor far more cost effectively, not by shortcutting materials, but by shortcutting the number of coats because we're solventless. We don't prime, base coat, 3 top coats.
Yep.
If you have a solventless top coat,
Yep.
meaning no evaporative component,
Yep.
you can apply 1 coat instead of having 3 trips to site to do the top coat. So that reluctance for change, I get the point and I'm habitual.
Yep.
But I also realise that once I question my assumptions and the things that I'm stuck on, then I often do find better ways of doing things.
Yeah, okay.
So I do encourage people to be at least open to thinking about different ways and be prepared to ask the question of their manufacturers or suppliers about different ways. Whether they change or not is a different thing, but if you're not open to it, you're not going to improve.
You've got to have a look. Yeah, exactly. Well, look, thank you very much for your time today. It's actually been quite educational for me.
Well, thank you for the invite.
It's and look, for anyone out there, if you're really wanting to find out some more information, wanting to get involved, go and look up Jack. I'll have his details and website and everything on what we've got there, and on the podcast and on the videos. So if you have any questions, reach out. He's your man. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, and I appreciate it.
Yep, no worries. Right. See you guys. See you all next time.
Take care.
Yep, happy painting.
Keep smiling.
Exactly. Thanks, mate.